Hey guys, I'm Eric Voss, and Rogue One: A Star Wars Story has been in theaters for a little while now. Now, we've already made a few other videos that explain some interesting stuff that we noticed, but let's face it, like any Star Wars movie, Rogue One is filled with Easter eggs and interesting history and design elements and missable references to the broader Star Wars universe and other iconic films. So just like last year's epic breakdown of The Force Awakens, here is another for Rogue One. Just think of it as a rewatch of Rogue One with an annotated nerd commentary, because everyone loves commentary, right? Of course you do. All right, let's get started with the opening images. So this film opens with the standard "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away," but unlike other Star Wars films, there's obviously no opening crawl. Now, according to director Gareth Edwards, an early draft of Gary Whitta's script did include a 4-sentence opening crawl, but the people at Lucasfilm said no because they wanted Rogue One to be a standalone film and not an official episode of the saga. But the idea is that between the prologue scene and the sentence in the opening crawl of A New Hope that John Knoll based this whole movie on, Rogue One doesn't need an opening crawl. We get what's going on. And at least this way, there's fewer giant yellow words littering the galaxy. That stuff piles up, guys. But Rogue One still does have a very classic Star Wars opening. There's a sudden orchestral punch from Michael Giacchino and a shot of space, and then notice how the shadow on the rings of Lamu forms this gray triangular shape. And I'm pretty sure that Edwards intended this to be a mirror of the hull of the Star Destroyers from the iconic opening shots of A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. So once again here, the Empire is descending onto a fugitive trying to escape it. Gareth Edwards is kind of a wizard when it comes to thinking about perspective and scale and how we perceive massive objects like the Death Star and Godzilla and your mom. Right? And repurposing these visuals in interesting ways. So I'll point out more examples as we go. Okay, moving on to Lamu, and right away we're seeing connections to A New Hope with a moisture farm and blue bantha milk, and this shot of Galen Erso looking out at the horizon, meant to reflect Luke's iconic horizon shot in A New Hope. And I think this scene of the Empire terrorizing meager moisture farmers is meant to remind us of the deaths of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, everyone's favorite charred skeletons, giving Luke and Jyn parallel origins. They're both farm kids who lose their guardians, forced to leave the farm behind. But while some elements of these two movies are meant to be parallel, there were also some key decisions made to make them inverses of each other. So for example, notice the color scheme. Director Krennic is dressed in white, flanked by black Death Troopers. Now, according to production designer Doug Chiang, that is meant to be a reversal from our first look of Darth Vader in A New Hope. He wore black, flanked by white stormtroopers. And Chiang said that that is meant to reflect an even broader reversal of this premise, with Luke being a farm boy who dreamt of being a warrior versus Jyn, who was forced into being a warrior at a young age and dreamt of a normal home life. And let's talk real quick about the Death Troopers, because the story behind them is pretty cool. The reason they're called Death Troopers is that the original idea was for them to be reanimated necrotic flesh. You know, space zombies. And some concept art proposed for them to have smaller or weirdly shaped heads to suggest that they weren't fully human, but something between droid and soldier. Now that's pretty crazy, so ultimately that idea was scrapped, but they still wanted to keep some of that inhuman appearance for the Death Troopers. Now they realized that normal stormtrooper armor makes actors look bulkier, so they intentionally cast taller, leaner actors for the Death Troopers to achieve that contrast and to reinforce the stereotype that freakishly tall people have no souls. Now getting back to Jyn, another interesting reversal was her stormtrooper doll, obviously meant as a reference to Rey's rebel doll in The Force Awakens. And I think this reflects another concept that Gareth Edwards wanted to explore in Rogue One, the gray area between good and evil in Star Wars. Now in the past it's always been pretty clear the rebels are noble freedom fighters and the Empire are evil space Nazis. But the fact that young Jyn Erso would look at the stormtroopers like G.I. Joes or Buzz Lightyears shows that from the ground level, before the Death Star is public knowledge at least, it's still not totally clear who the good guys are. And we actually went into this in another video, but Rogue One really nails that fog of war down to the details. And before I move on, I want to point out that Jyn originally wasn't the main focus of this movie. In the beginning, John Knoll proposed this as a streamlined military heist movie centered on a team. And for the pitch, they edited together a sizzle reel using footage from Mission Impossible and Hunt for Red October, and at the time, Knoll titled the project The Destroyer of Worlds. Then Gareth Edwards reconceived the story with Jyn as the focus. He also scrapped alternate concept ideas of Jyn's character, like having a little brother that she needed to protect, and the idea that her mom would be a Jedi, and instead Edwards made her focused on daddy issues with Galen Erso, the man who built the Death Star. Okay, let's move on to the Rogue One title, which floats back into space to join all the other space litter. And we also hear composer Michael Giacchino's new Rogue One theme. Now, I should mention that Giacchino only had 4.5 weeks to compose this entire score, as opposed to the full year that film composers normally get. That's because previous composer Alexandre Desplat stepped down due to scheduling conflicts during reshoots. Now, Giacchino previously stepped aside from longtime collaborator J.J. Abrams to let John Williams do the score for The Force Awakens. Instead, Giacchino made a cameo as a stormtrooper. But even Giacchino's rush job is still pretty effective. The score is 98% new, with just a few subtle moments where Giacchino samples John Williams' iconic Star Wars music, which I'll point out as we go. All right, moving on to the introduction of adult Jyn Erso, played by Felicity Jones. Now, I should point out that this scene in Imperial Prison, along with her rescue and the introductions of Cassian and Bodhi, were all among the scenes that were added during reshoots. Now, the filmmakers thought it would be pretty jarring to jump from Jyn's flashback as a girl into the rebel interrogation, where, if you remember in the first teaser footage, Jyn seems kind of sarcastic.
This is a rebellion, isn't it? I rebel.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
And all that was changed to make Jyn more sympathetic, more of a victim of her circumstances. And opening with Jyn behind bars is a key part of her journey in this movie. So in addition to the obvious theme of hope, Rogue One is about characters transitioning from imprisonment, from feeling trapped, to making their own free choices, going rogue. And fun fact, the prequel novel Catalyst explains that Jyn was born while her mother and her father were in political prison following a separatist coup on their home planet of Vault. So really, a life of incarceration is all Jyn really knows. And I like how Gareth Edwards starts this movie with dark, cramped, claustrophobic shots of Jyn, but as she begins to go rogue, her surroundings begin to open up around her, which Edwards shows with increasingly wider shots. And real quick, Jyn's Cthulhu-looking cellmate is Ulan Musters, a rebel prisoner. The novelization reveals that these two hate each other, and she actually threatens to kill Jyn in the next time they're out on the labor camp. So Jyn broke out just in time to avoid some Ulan is the new black drama. All right, moving on to our first look at Diego Luna's Captain Cassian Andor on the Ring of Kafrene. Now, by the way, this is the first Star Wars movie to feature titles explaining to us each new location. The editors explain that in addition to not using the classic Star Wars wipes, they wanted to use transitions to help give Rogue One a standalone look. Now, it was pretty surprising to see Cassian as a cold-blooded killer, but the Ultimate Visual Guide explains that one of his aliases is Fulcrum. Now, in the Star Wars universe, a Fulcrum agent is kind of like a 00 agent for the Rebel Alliance. Now, this is from Star Wars Rebels, where Fulcrum was a code name for ex-Jedi Ahsoka Tano. So this makes Cassian more of a James Bond, Jason Bourne style assassin, and less of the friendly rebel recruitment officer that he was described as. And the spy whom Cassian kills is named Tivik, and he's a member of the Partisans. That's the offshoot group of extremist rebels that Saw Gerrera heads up. We'll meet the rest of them soon. But quickly, check out the look of this trading outpost. Gareth Edwards and the set designers modeled it on the grimy underworld that we saw in the movie Blade Runner, which was set in Los Angeles in the distant future of 2019. Because that's only 2 years from now. You get it? All right, let's move on to Jedha with Bodhi Rook, played by Riz Ahmed. We meet the rest of the Partisans, including Beezer Fortuna, Benthic and Edrio Two Tubes, and Moroff. Now, promotional material made Moroff seem like he was going to be a much bigger character than he ended up being, but the story behind him was pretty interesting because he's a relic of a different version of this movie, the Ensemble Heist version that was altered during development. So that original team included a duo named Senna and Lunik. Senna was a large alien creature who they imagined at one point hauling a massive Imperial computer, perhaps containing the Death Star plans. And Lunik was a smaller buddy who hung out on Senna's shoulders, who would crawl through air vents. Now, Lunik was scrapped completely, and Senna went through several redesigns before they settled on Moroff. And ultimately, the filmmakers moved away from this original team, including other original members like Dre Nevis, Ria Tala, and Jaris Castal, leaving just Jyn and K2SO, and replacing the duo of Senna and Lunik with Chirrut and Baze. Maybe they felt Senna and Lunik were just a little too similar to Groot and Rocket Raccoon in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, or more likely, the filmmakers were under pressure to include Chinese actors like Donnie Yen and Zhang Wen to make the movie more marketable to Chinese audiences, and therefore make a ton more money. So big Hollywood movies altering their scripts to appease the Chinese film board is a huge, complex trend that I'm not really going to get into here, but if you're wondering why China saved the day in The Martian, or why Marvel changed a Tibetan character in Doctor Strange, remember, this is a business, and billions of Chinese people love Hollywood movies. Moving on to Jyn's rescue on Wobani, which by the way is an anagram for Obi-Wan. Don't have anything to say about that other than it's an anagram. Now, Jyn is traveling in an Imperial Juggernaut tank, which you might remember seeing in Revenge of the Sith. And we meet my favorite character in this movie, K2SO.
Congratulations.
You are being rescued.
Voiced and performed via motion capture by Alan Tudyk. Now, originally, K2SO was a black Imperial Protocol droid, kind of like C-3PO's cousin, who's a former Nazi and you don't really talk about it. After several redesigns, they settled on a taller Imperial security droid. And Tudyk's performance is a big reason why K2SO works so great in Rogue One. He actually has a lot of experience doing comedic voiceover work, and he specifically voiced a robot with a similar dry sense of humor in the movie I, Robot.
Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
Now, Tudyk also worked with the New York mask teacher Orlando Pabatoy to learn to express himself without using facial expressions, which is why so much humor comes in physicality.
There are a lot of explosions for two people blending in.
Freeze! Right there!
That doesn't sound so bad to me.
Also, apparently, Tudyk improvised a ton of his lines, specifically when K2SO slaps Cassian.
Where are you taking these prisoners?
He is taking us to quiet. And there's a fresh one if you mouth off again.
You can actually kind of see Diego Luna smiling behind his hand there. All right, let's move on to Yavin 4. And if you look closely as Jen walks through the Rebel hangar, you can actually see a Gonk droid, as well as a few astromech droids, which some people are saying are R4M9 and R5X3, who have shown up in other Star Wars movies, but it's kind of hard to confirm that exactly. And as Jen receives her assignment from the Rebel leaders, we see Genevieve O'Reilly and Jimmy Smits reprising their roles as Mon Mothma and Bail Organa from Revenge of the Sith. We also see General Jan Dodonna from A New Hope, now played by Ian McElhinney, aka Sir Barristan Selmy from Game of Thrones. And it looks like the set designers built an exact replica of the Rebel command room from A New Hope, and I wouldn't be surprised if George Lucas just like keeps this set somewhere on Skywalker Ranch, like a poker room or something. Now, another interesting fact about the scene is that, according to the editors, the dialogue and the pacing of the scene were based on the interrogation scene with Ripley at the beginning of the movie Aliens. And both of these movies feature strong female leads reluctantly leading soldiers on a space mission to redeem themselves and prevent catastrophic destruction. Now, as Jen and Cassian depart, we get a good look at the Rebel base. And like in A New Hope, this was filmed at Cardington Sheds in Bedfordshire, England, which is a former Royal Air Force hangar that is now a film studio. And the first Star Wars production used the interior with the exterior shots of the temple pyramid being just like a matte painting. But for Rogue One, they did a full set build out, both the interior and the exterior. Also, just like they did in A New Hope, the set designers reportedly used cardboard cutouts of X-Wings to fill in the background of the airfield. But let's talk about this new ship, the U-Wing. The U-Wing was originally conceived to be larger, like the size of the Millennium Falcon, with a detachable, smaller ship that could go down to a planet's surface. Then Gareth Edwards realized that they just needed a transport-sized X-Wing for the story. Now, designer Doug Chang said that he grew up drawing X-Wings from A New Hope, and that he was super excited to design a new ship that would be an alteration on that, with folding wings to imply that it was made from the same X and Y-Wing manufacturer, Incom. And they went through hundreds of designs with an alternate Z-Wing, an R-Wing, and Q-Wing, and eventually settled on the U-Wing modeled on a catamaran. Basically, they wanted a ship that kids would want to pick up and play with, just like they would an X-Wing. Just another reminder, guys, that this is a business, and it's all about selling toys. Preferably toys that Chinese kids would want to play with. And if you were wondering why we see so few U-Wings and why they don't really exist in A New Hope and the other movies, the Ultimate Visual Guide explains that the U-Wing was a new design from Incom, and they only released a limited number before the manufacturer was nationalized by the Empire. And Bail Organa was able to get his hands on a few of them and donated them to the Rebellion. And before I move on, I just love the detail that went into the scene with the U-Wing taking off, with Giacchino sampling John Williams' Force theme, and the inclusion of the Rebel Recon Officer from A New Hope, who really has the worst job in the Rebellion, right? Like, you really couldn't put a droid up there? That's gotta be a punishment, you know? Okay, moving on to this scene with Bodhi and Saw Gerrera, played by Forrest Whitaker. Gerrera came from Gareth Edwards' desire to include a character who was more of an extremist side of the Rebellion, like how in real wars, well-intentioned freedom fighters can sometimes go too far and become terrorists. Now, the original concept art was for the character to be a World of Warcraft-style troll creature, but then Lucasfilm VP Kiri Hart suggested to use Saw Gerrera, who was a pre-existing character from Clone Wars. Ultimately, they made a version of Saw Gerrera that was older and crippled by years of fighting, a lot like Darth Vader. And actually, there's a little detail that they added to Gerrera here that ties him to Vader. So notice how when Gerrera stands over Bodhi and breathes from his mask, you can hear Darth Vader's iconic breathing mixed in with the audio. Now, we don't hear that later when Gerrera uses his mask, and I think they included it here to intimidate Bodhi and us by evoking Vader. I swear, when I get older, I'm just gonna put an oxygen tank in the Camelback and use that mask to scare little kids all the time. I can't wait to get close to death. All right, let's move on to Krennic and Tarkin. Now, I made another video about the visual effects that went into animating the likeness of Peter Cushing and how actor Guy Henry stood in with an imitation of the character. Definitely check that out. But since then, we've learned even more about this process, with Henry imitating Cushing down to the square shape he makes with his mouth.
Charming to the last.
And the use of the special motion capture headgear that synced up Henry's facial movements with the animation. And I know some people are still divided about whether it was ethical to use the likeness of a deceased actor like this. So was it justified? Well, let's let John Knoll explain. He was the visual effects supervisor who did all of these effects.
This work was done with great affection and care. I'd like to think that the role that we gave Tarkin in this film is one that Peter Cushing would have been really very excited and happy to play.
Ultimately, I think they were justified because they got the permission of the family, and this seems like an extremely costly, not at all casual process that was really a one-time thing.
The original plans for this station are kept there, are they not?
And yeah, let's be honest, it would be a little confusing to see a story about the Death Star becoming operational and Tarkin not to be part of that.
You may fire when ready.
He'd have to like conference call in or something. And in fact, according to production, if they couldn't get the CGI right, they considered a backup plan of Tarkin appearing via hologram instead, you know, like Tupac. And this whole spiteful interaction between director Krennic and Tarkin here is meant to connect to the Tarkin meeting scene in A New Hope. Like, Krennic was originally based on the white uniformed officer who sits at the table. And in that scene, Tarkin has that line about the Emperor dissolving the Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us.
Something that is a major concern of Rogue One Tarkin.
If the Senate gets wind of our project, countless systems will flock to the rebellion.
Also, a lot of people are pointing out that that scene in A New Hope had one empty seat at the table, and that seat might have belonged to Krennic. Now, Ben Mendelsohn is an Australian actor, and he uses an interesting accent for Krennic, allowing some of his Australian twang to still come through.
One had hoped that he and Lord Vader might have been here for such an occasion. I will not fail.
Now, that contrasts the traditional British accent that most Imperial officers have, including Tarkin.
This bickering is pointless.
And it suggests that Krennic came from a different background and had to work his way up, and has more of a chip on his shoulder, whereas Tarkin seems more privileged and snobby. Now, the shot of the Death Star firing dish lowering into place was made specifically for the trailer, and concept art revealed that it was originally part of a much longer sequence that showed the dish launching from a mountaintop lake on a hidden base, with thrusters lifting it out of the atmosphere through space to the Death Star. And Gareth Edwards said that he came up with the idea to use the shadow of the dish by using a virtual camera setup on an iPad from Industrial Light and Magic. And that allowed him to visualize how these big pieces could move. And at one point he asked, what if we added a light here? And the shadow that it created inspired an entire visual language for Rogue One. Like in many of Edwards' best shots in this movie, a close-up of a shadow makes the viewer wonder what it is we're looking at. And then once we realize it's a shadow of a larger object, it gives us a context of scale. This all gives Rogue One a distinct look from the other Star Wars movies. And before I move on, the visual guide explains how the Death Star project was kept secret all these years. So if you remember, at the end of Attack of the Clones, early construction for the Death Star began on the planet Geonosis. And then once the framework was complete, the Empire sterilized the entirety of Geonosis, wiping out a population of billions just to keep it secret. Like, I mean, I know they're bugs, but that's messed up. That's like Starship Troopers level messed up.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
Okay, moving on to this quick dream flashback of Jyn and her parents when they still worked for director Krennic. Now, if you look in the background, that is Coruscant. This hints at a much deeper backstory between the Ursos and Krennic from the Rogue One novelization and Catalyst. To quickly summarize it, Galen worked for Krennic on Coruscant on Project Celestial Power, refining kyber crystals to create what he thought was a new energy source, when really it was just for a super weapon.
I need you to come back. I won't do it, Krennic. We were this close to providing peace and security for the galaxy. You're confusing peace with terror. Well, you have to start somewhere.
So they fled, with Lyra taking this kyber crystal necklace with her as a good omen. And I have a theory on that necklace that I'll talk about later. Now, we've talked about this before, but this is modeled on the real-life physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, whose research on the Manhattan Project led to the development of the atomic bomb, which he later came to regret. Fun fact here, Rogue One was actually shipped out to theaters under the codename Los Alamos, which is where the Manhattan Project research was conducted. Now, on Jeddah, this shot of Cassian and Jyn scoping out the plateau was recreated from this concept art that depicted Jeddah as dirtier and more industrial, clearly showing the effects of Imperial mining. That's why when they fly over the planet, Cassian says this line.
That's Jeddah, or what's left of it.
And if you look closely, you can see a new Imperial mining shuttle. Now, according to Doug Chang, this shuttle was modeled on Darth Vader's Lambda-class shuttle from Return of the Jedi. But instead of 3 folding wings, this one has 4. And Chang wanted it to look like an old Viking sailing ship that when it comes to a dock, all the oars are rested straight up. All right, let's talk about this scene with Bor Gullet. That's the tentacle alien that Saw Gerrera uses to interrogate people. Now, the idea for Bor Gullet came from writer Chris Weitz. It's a telepathic cephalopod that can understand exactly what you're thinking and feed off your emotions. And its whole design with these absorbing tentacles seems like a reference to the aliens in Gareth Edwards' earlier film, Monsters. But honestly, other than verifying that Bodhi is indeed telling the truth about defecting, or as this movie's version of the needle droid on the Death Star in A New Hope, Bor Gullet seems like kind of a loose end to me. Now, I think he had a larger purpose to the story that was left out in the final version of the film. My theory is that he was going to interrogate Jyn, or maybe Cassian, to reveal that his true mission was to actually assassinate Galen. Or, you know, maybe Bor Gullet was just this movie's version of a weird monster, which exists in pretty much every Star Wars movie. Or maybe Saw Gerrera uses Bor Gullet for like weird sex stuff.
Bor Gullet, when will you come?
Now, the city of Jeddah is filled with references to Star Wars history. There's this shiny RA-7 protocol droid and a probe droid from The Empire Strikes Back. And I'm sure you all caught the cameos by Dr. Cornelius Evazan and Ponda Baba, aka Walrus Face, from the Mos Eisley Cantina in A New Hope.
He doesn't like you.
They don't like Jyn either. And other than it being kind of hilarious that these two planet hoppers just pick fights with anything that moves, there's actually a really interesting backstory that explains why they're even on Jeddah right now. So in the expanded universe, Evazan is this crazy cosmetic surgeon, and originally he and Ponda Baba were named Rufu and Saki, according to a 1981 radio drama. And the Rogue One visual guide explains that a lawman named Tam Pazla is searching for Rufu and Saki, which are aliases for Evazan and Baba, for kidnapping, forced servitude, and surgical alteration to victims of terrorism on Jeddah. And actually, Pazla showed up in a shot from the trailer along with this guy, remember him, old hairy arms, no head. He was one of their freak surgery patients, along with another concept element that didn't make it in the final film, the Decraniated, who are humans whose heads were shaved off and turned into this cyborg servant class. So way to go, Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba. You two are even more human garbage than we thought. Walrus garbage. Then Jyn meets Donnie Yen's Chirrut Îmwe and Jang Wen's Baze Malbus. And we get a few deep throwbacks to the earliest origin of Star Wars. So Chirrut chants, "May the force of others be with you," which is an early version of "May the Force be with you" from a previous draft of George Lucas's script for A New Hope. Also, Cassian mentions that these two guys are guardians of the Whills. That's Whills spelled W-H-I-L-L-S. That is a reference to the original title of Lucas's script, which was The Adventures of Luke Starkiller as taken from the Journal of the Whills. So, Lucas conceived the Whills as a race of wise alien beings who founded the Force as a faith. And the whole Star Wars saga is the Whills elders narrating an ancient myth from their archives to their pupils, which is the origin of A Long Time Ago in a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Of course, George Lucas decided that the audience didn't really need this complicated framing device, so he dropped it. But since Rogue One is already so connected to that original Episode 4 story, it's cool to see the background of that story work its way back into the films too. Now, one of the best things about this sequence was the war imagery used by Gareth Edwards and his team. So when pitching his version of Rogue One, Edwards used real war photography from Vietnam and World War II and Middle Eastern conflicts, photoshopping rebel helmets onto the tops of real soldiers. And that vision influenced all parts of this movie, with the art department modeling Jeddah on places like Jerusalem and the Wadi Rock of Jordan, as well as Nazi-occupied Paris during World War II. Now, the cinematographer, Greg Fraser, shot Zero Dark 30 as well, and he helped bring this gritty vision to the screen. And notice the framing and the slow buildup of this entire sequence. It seems like a reference to another famous war movie, Saving Private Ryan, which also features a tank ambush in a city. And just like Saving Private Ryan, Rogue One aims to depict the whole fog of war with friendly fire and children caught in the crossfire. The little girl who Jyn saves is named Pinbra. The novelization reveals she and her family don't make it out of Jeddah City when the Death Star attack comes. She dies in her father's arms, and we learn that they never even see the Emerald Light or hear the thunder. It's very sad. Almost as sad as billions of genocided bugs on Geonosis. Never forget, guys. And this little badass is another partisan fighter named Weetief Hubie. He's played by Warwick Davis, keeping in with the tradition of playing Star Wars characters with W names, like Wicket the Ewok from Return of the Jedi, Wald and Weasel from The Phantom Menace, and Wallavan in The Force Awakens. Now, when Chirrut saves Cassian and Jyn from stormtroopers, I just want to clarify again that he is not a Jedi, but he is at least low-level Force sensitive. Despite his blindness, he could sense Jyn's Kyber crystal necklace, and the novel reveals that he knows Cassian is a captain. Plus, obviously, he daredevils an entire squad of stormtroopers, so, you know, there's gotta be at least a few midichlorians bumping around in there somewhere. Ugh, just saying the word midichlorians feels like vomit in my mouth. Saw Gerrera's hideout is another location that's filled with Easter eggs. There's a non-hologram version of Dejarik, which is the chess game that we saw in the Millennium Falcon in A New Hope and Force Awakens. And I actually think that these game pieces are the ones used by the production crew of The Force Awakens to make those holograms. There's also some softcore holo porn of a dancing Twilight girl, which we saw in Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. Also, I couldn't spot them, but Gareth Edwards said that the set designers slipped in paintings of the creatures from Monsters and the Muto from Godzilla on the walls in the background. Now, notice this moment when Chirrut tells Cassian,
"There is more than one sort of prison. I sense that you carry yours wherever you go."
That connects back to the theme of imprisonment that I mentioned earlier. So, like Jyn, Cassian is trapped in his position as rebel assassin, and he's struggling with an urge to go rogue and make his own choices. There's also this fun little reference when Gerrera says,
It's a trap.
which Whittaker doesn't really deliver with any kind of wink, but come on, you can't say it's a trap in a Star Wars movie without it being an Admiral Akbar reference.
It's a trap.
I also appreciated this line from Jyn.
You can stand to see the Imperial flag reign across the galaxy.
It's not a problem if you don't look up.
Now, obviously, this is flawed thinking by Jyn. Like, the Empire isn't a problem normal people can just ignore. Like, in fact, at this very moment, the Death Star is about to nuke all of them, whether or not Jyn looks up. I think Jyn is referencing the first moment she joined up with Saw, back in that first scene when she looks up at him. In other words, Jyn could be telling Saw right now, my life would be better off without you. And based on Saw's hurt expression, I think that's how he takes it. Aw, give Saw a hug, poor Gullet. I said a hug. I said a hug, not a snug. Meanwhile, on the Death Star, notice the look of the Death Star targeting screen. I think that is modeled on screens that show military drone strikes, with an overhead view and no audio, just a silent explosion and the unsettling knowledge that you just killed a ton of people.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And fun thing to point out here, the two Death Star operators on the ledge by the super laser are played by Rian Johnson and Ron Bergman, who are the director and producer of the upcoming Star Wars Episode 8. And they promised to let Gareth Edwards make a cameo in that movie to return the favor. And these characters must have also pissed off someone important to have to stand right next to a super laser with no railing, kind of like the rebel recon officer of the Empire. Pointless job. Now, this moment of anger between Krennic and Tarkin is super interesting because a set photo was recently released showing Krennic pointing a blaster at someone in that location. So based on the angle, it seems like it would be Tarkin. So maybe at some point there was an alternate version of the scene that led to Krennic drawing a blaster on his superior officer and having to be talked down. Directa you may not bio en rede. All right, moving on to Edu. Now, the look of this planet is another reference to the Alien franchise. The set designers modeled the stormy, rocky terrain on the planet LV-426. And then, along with the great Han Solo reference that we got in the last scene,
Punch it!
Punch it.
I really liked Cassian saying that he didn't want to know,
Well, now there's a 35% chance of
I don't want
failure.
to know. Thank you.
I understand.
which seems like this movie's version of Never Tell Me the Odds.
The possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1.
Never tell me the odds.
Now, before we move on past this Edu section, I want to pause on this moment with Cassian aiming his sniper rifle at Galen on the platform. So notice the sound design as the raindrops hit the metal of the gun. I think that this moment is another reference to Saving Private Ryan. Now, let's move on to the most interesting location in this movie. This is Mustafar. Interestingly, the only planet not to receive a title, which is the same volcanic planet where Anakin and Obi-Wan battled at the end of Revenge of the Sith. So, why would Darth Vader build his home in a place with so many unhappy memories? Vader needs to reinforce his anger and suffering to keep him connected to the dark side, like moving into the same building as your ex-girlfriend. The pain makes me strong. I don't do that. I'm not a stalker. But really, the design elements that went into this location are super interesting. They based the look of Vader's castle on sketches drawn by Ralph McQuarrie in the late 70s after A New Hope, which were to be used for The Empire Strikes Back, but were ultimately left out. The artwork showed a tall, grim castle in the middle of a lava lake, along with a mysterious lava cavern with a throne. The designers began with this vision and then fleshed it out into a place that Vader could practically live in and heal himself and meditate. So they used the Bacta healing tank, which we saw Luke use in The Empire Strikes Back, and Gareth Edwards insisted on featuring it. So Gareth Edwards loved that brief glimpse that we saw of the back of Darth Vader's head in Empire, and he wanted our first look of Vader in Rogue One to be at his most vulnerable, as an amputee, humanizing him just enough to balance the dark, violent place he ends up in the final sequence. They also wanted this place to show Vader as a true Sith. So not only is there Sith artwork on the walls, this entire castle is in the shape of a giant tuning fork, which Edwards described as Vader tuning himself to the dark side. It's also meant to be a mirror opposite of the Temple of Kyber on Jedha, which has a similar look, except it's white. One temple for the light side of the Force and one for the dark. And like that temple on Jedha, Vader's castle might have ancient religious roots as well. So designer Doug Chiang conceived the foundation of this castle to be an underground Sith cave, and the lava river flows through it like a dam, feeding the castle energy. So the theory is that Vader chose this spot in particular to connect his home to a site of historical significance to the Sith, and to build his contribution on top of that. And really, the fact that the creative team has put so much thought into this makes me think that we might see this cave, perhaps in Episode 8, with Luke Skywalker revisiting his father's past. I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, getting back to Vader, Edwards gives us this classic shot of him using his iconic silhouette in the shadow on the wall, completely enveloping Krennic. And naturally, Giacchino samples John Williams' Imperial March here. Also, it's interesting how Vader seems upset with Krennic for destroying Jedha. He claims it's because they risked alerting the Senate about the Death Star, but really, I think Vader is just deeply religious. And part of him feels furious that this holy city and possible origin of the Force was wiped out for a demonstration of military power. And remember, the last time an arrogant officer bragged about the Death Star's technological superiority,
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe. Hidden Fort.
Vader's response was the same as it is with Krennic.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
More like, don't choke on your popcorn after that hilarious pun. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry, it was super funny. And before I move on, a lot of people were wondering who this hooded figure is. Like when the trailer came out, we speculated that it could be Emperor Palpatine, or maybe even Snoke. Turns out it's Vani, Vader's creepy assistant and caretaker who, like probably sniffs Vader's helmet when he takes it off. Now some people are saying that he might actually have been one of the guys in the Emperor's entourage in Return of the Jedi. Now, the council meeting on Yavin 4 gives us a look at the full Rebel leadership. Now, besides Return of the Jedi, it's pretty rare to see everyone in the same room like this, both politicians and military. This leadership includes the civil government led by Senator Mon Mothma, along with Bail Organa of Alderaan, Noor Jebel of Uter, Vaspar of the Tal'Dot sector, and Tenra Pomlo of Taris. That's from the Knights of the Old Republic games. It also includes the military high command, including General Jan Dodonna, General Draven, Blue Squadron leader General Merrick, and this awesome new Mon Calamari, Admiral Raddus. Now, character designer Neil Scanlon modeled Raddus on Winston Churchill, borrowing the World War II era British Prime Minister's likeness and mannerisms, along with his general eagerness to fight.
I say we fight!
And right after the scene, you might have heard someone call for General Syndulla. Now, obviously, that's a reference to Hera from the Rebels series, implying that she could have gotten promoted. Or it could also be referring to her father, Cham Syndulla from Clone Wars. Also, the new character, Pal, shows up here. Pal actually appeared in the concept art for The Force Awakens, but they didn't use him in that movie, and they used him here instead. Now, I already talked about this scene between Mon Mothma and Bail Organa in my other video that explained how this movie's ending fits in with A New Hope, but if you listen closely to Organa at the end of this scene, you can hear him call for Captain Antilles.
Captain Antilles Center.
That's Captain Ramus Antilles, the captain of the Tantive 4. We saw him taking R2 and 3PO at the end of Revenge of the Sith, and he is Darth Vader's first on-screen kill in A New Hope. All right, let's move on to Scarif. And this may just be a coincidence, but the name Scarif sounds very similar to the term SCIF, which is a military acronym for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. It's a place that's used to store classified military information. And with that Citadel Tower, that's exactly what Scarif is. But before we get to this planet, we see these quick shots of Jyn holding her Kyber crystal necklace. Now this thing has come up a few times on Lamu, on Jedha, and why is it so important? Now, it could be related to the deleted scenes, or maybe it's just meant as a token for Jyn's connection to her parents. But I have a theory that goes way deeper. So, we know Kyber crystals radiate a supernatural kind of energy. They power lightsabers and the Death Star super laser, and Chirrut's proximity to them definitely seems to have left them with some special abilities. We also know from the Skywalkers that Force sensitivity is passed down through family bloodlines. So let's go back to Lyra Erso, Jyn's mother. Lyra, being a Jedi, was scrapped for the final film, but I think the necklace is a relic of that backstory. It's possible that wearing this Kyber crystal still might have given Lyra low-level Force sensitivity, a protective energy, which she then passed on to Jyn. Like, notice how shortly after Lyra gives away the necklace, she dies. And then, as Jyn wears the necklace, she's able to barely survive extreme close calls until she's able to squeak by and carry out the mission that ultimately turns the tides against the Empire. Now, we had a similar theory for The Force Awakens with Poe Dameron. The book Shattered Empire suggested that he grew up with this ancient Force tree at his home, given to his family by Luke Skywalker. And living in proximity to that concentrated Force energy might have made him a ridiculously good pilot, the same way that this Kyber crystal could give Jyn Force sensitivity. Now, you could call all of that plot armor, like these are just the main characters, so of course they're naturally good at surviving. But I call it the Force working in mysterious ways, giving each of these individuals the slightest edge against the otherwise unchecked dark forces that take over the galaxy. But let's move on to Scarif. Obviously, several steps of the Rogue One crew's infiltration mirrors tactics from the other Star Wars movies, like using a stolen Imperial code to sneak onto a planet, which happened in Return of the Jedi, and of course, sneaking into an Imperial base in Imperial disguise, which happened in A New Hope. And the parallels to A New Hope continue with cameos by a mouse droid, and K2SO having the same rotary-style scomp link that R2-D2 uses to hack into the Imperial database. And then of course, K2SO utters the line, "I have a bad feeling about this," that appears in every Star Wars movie, but Jyn and Cassian cut him off before he can finish.
I've got a bad feeling about it.
Quiet.
Perhaps as a nod to the fact that Rogue One isn't a full episode in the Star Wars saga, so maybe they can't say the full line? I don't know. There's also this fun banter between stormtroopers on the beach.
Hey, did you hear the rumors? Yeah, the T-15s have been marked obsolete. Oh boy, it's about time for that.
And this seems like a reference to the small talk between stormtroopers on the Death Star while Obi-Wan snuck around them.
You seen that new BT-16?
But this connection goes even further. The T-15 is a predecessor of the T-16 Skyhopper, which is the ship that Luke owned on Tatooine, the one he used to bullseye womp rats in Beggar's Canyon, you know, the ones that aren't much bigger than 2 meters. Meanwhile, back at Yavin 4, we get a few more cameos. First, there's an easily missable cameo by Chopper, C-110P. That's the lovable a-hole astromech droid from Rebels. And then an even more subtle cameo by another astromech droid and this protocol droid whose names are escaping me at the moment, but they seem to show up in like every Star Wars movie, so random. Now, the ground battle on Scarif was shot with two major influences. The first was the movie The Thin Red Line, which is a war epic that takes place in the Pacific in World War II. And that movie came out in the same year as Saving Private Ryan. And I think many of these tropical beach shots seem to be borrowing from that movie. But also, Gareth Edwards loved the trench battle on Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. And he said that when he went back to watch the movie, he was surprised that the scene only lasted like 2 minutes. So he wanted to expand the ground battle for Rogue One. Another mix of World War II history and past Star Wars films came into the design of the new shore troopers. The designer said that their look was a mix of the camo coloration on the scout troopers from Endor in Return of the Jedi, plus part of the clone trooper helmet design, and finally the color scheme of the Messerschmitt. That was a German World War II fighter plane, which had an earth tone base and distinct splashes of bright colors. And for the shore troopers, those colors denote rank, with blue across the shoulders and collar for squad leader, and a blue chest plate and yellow band on the gauntlet for captain. And in addition to World War II, the Vietnam War inspired a lot of elements in this battle as well. So the new TIE Strikers were designed to be in-atmosphere fighters that only defend the surface, with the wings on top that would create a silhouette of the rotor blades of a Vietnam-era Huey helicopter from a distance. Also, this shot of Bistan firing a mounted gun out of the U-wing looks like it's a reference to the Get Some scene in Full Metal Jacket. Get some, baby! Okay, let's talk about the space battle above the planet, which is up there as one of the best space battles we've seen in Star Wars. There are cameos by a ton of familiar ships. A lot of people spotted the Ghost from Rebels, making people think that there's going to be a Rebels episode where we see them in the Battle of Scarif. But there's also the EF-76 Nebulon B escort frigate. That's the ship that Luke and Leia regroup on after Cloud City. It's also seen in the Battle of Endor. There's also the GR-75 medium transport, which we saw during the retreat from Hoth in Empire Strikes Back. Also, the visual guide gave us some really interesting background on the Mon Calamari Calamari ships. They're actually former Mon Calamari buildings and city blocks converted into these massive passenger transports. They all contain thousands of refugees. Specifically, Radiss's ship, which is called the Profundity, was previously part of the Mon Calamari city of Nistulum. And Radiss was actually that city's mayor before it joined up with the Alliance fleet. And all of this gives us some context of why Admiral Akbar's flagship was called Home 1. It was literally his home. Now, my CGI breakdown briefly touched on the cameos by Red Leader Garvin Dryce and Gold Leader John Vander, and obviously these cameos weren't animated with CGI, but like Tarkin and Leia, they were created using archive footage. So Gareth Edwards and his team went through the Lucasfilm warehouse, and they found old film canisters containing unedited footage from A New Hope. And they found shots of the Red and the Gold Leader, and they decided to include them as inserts. Also, Gold Leader actor Angus McInnes is still alive, so they were able to re-record his audio over that old footage. We also see the Blue Squadron of X-Wings in action. Fun fact about those, the original X-Wings in A New Hope were supposed to be Blue Squadron, not Red. But the blue screen technology at the time interfered with the paint on the ships and the blue on the costumes, so back with the first film it was changed to the Red Squadron. In fact, you can kind of see this coloring problem with R2's blue panels appearing gray and black in the trench run. And speaking of that Red Squadron, this battle specifically shows the death of Red 5.
Red 5! I need help!
Leaving the call sign Red 5 vacant for Luke to take it over in the Battle of Yavin.
Red 5 standing by.
We also get to see a Hammerhead Corvette, which might be one of the ones that Princess Leia stole for the Rebellion in Star Wars Rebels. And it's fascinating to see a ship used as a battering ram in a space battle. I feel like that's the first in Star Wars. Battering rams were something from medieval warfare. Like armies would use them to bust through the gates into a fortress. And that's what this battering ram does. It smashes into a disabled Star Destroyer, colliding it with another Star Destroyer and sending them both busting through the shield gate to open up this planetary fortress. And in case you were wondering if any of the crew of the Hammerhead cruiser survived, or if it was a true kamikaze attack, John Knoll said that the VFX team actually animated a bunch of escape pods blasting off the Hammerhead at the last second. But Gareth Edwards thought it was too distracting, so he cut it out of the shot. But if you look closely as the two Star Destroyers go down, according to Knoll, all the lifeboats are gone from the Hammerhead, implying that they initially survived this. However, even though they made it, Knoll mused that the pods would have just made it down to the Scarif surface, just in time for the Death Star super laser to hit. So yeah, war is hell. And back in the Citadel Tower, there's a few other references worth mentioning here. Gareth Edwards said that he paid tribute to George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. And I think we see that when Cassian has to use the handles to extract a file from the vault, which is similar to a scene in that movie. Also, when Jyn is going through the file names, she mentions one called Black Saber. Now, a lot of people are saying that could be a reference to the Dark Saber from Clone Wars. It's an ancient black-bladed lightsaber stolen from the Jedi by the Mandalorians and later owned by Darth Maul, who is somehow still alive, but along with the Ghost and Chopper and General Syndulla. I just feel like these references to the animated series probably won't be anything more than just references. Like both Dave Filoni of Rebels and Gareth Edwards said that they don't really want any characters crossing over or their stories building off of each other. So if it was intentional, it's just really meant for the fans. All right, moving on to Jyn and Cassian's final moments. So with the running metaphor of the Death Star being a game-changing weapon of mass destruction like the nuclear bomb, I don't think it was an accident that this shot on the beach looks a lot like the footage of the nuclear bomb testing on the Bikini Atoll Islands in the Pacific. So this kind of brings it full circle with the history. But I love how Gareth Edwards turns an image that should be terrifying and kind of a downer into something almost poetic. And the reason this feels satisfying is that Jyn and Cassian have completed their journeys out of the prisons that they were trapped in at the beginning of the movie. Jyn out of literal prison, and Cassian out of the prison he carried with him. Like the opening images of both of these characters showed them in dark, cramped places that reflected this imprisonment. And now they're in a wide open space surrounded by light. By the way, I think there's a good chance that this ending was part of the reshoots, and I get into my alternate ending theory in another video, but also concept art shows us an image of Jyn looking at the Death Star plans in a whole new location, implying that they might have wanted her to survive in the previous version of the story. Also, an ABC News special on K2SO included footage from what must have been an alternate ending because it shows Alan Tudyk in this mocap suit getting gunned down on this sandy beach, not inside the Citadel Tower. And if you look closely next to him, that is the body of Cassian. And we know that an earlier draft of the screenplay ended with at least some of them surviving, so at least there was some version of Rogue One that might not have been as dark. But obviously that wasn't the case in the final film, because this movie was merciless to all of its main characters. It was as if millions of voices cried out in terror. What about the theory that Jyn is Rey's mom? I thought the Rogue One crew was gonna be the Knights of Ren. And were suddenly silenced. All right, let's move on to the very final sequence. And clearly Gareth Edwards doesn't like people walking out of his movies early because this was insane. Now there's a lot of reasons it works so well, but the main one is that this movie stops being Rogue One, which arguably ended on the beach, and starts being a prologue to A New Hope. The editors said that while they were reconfiguring this whole third act sequence after the reshoots, they realized that these final shots really belonged in Episode 4 because everything about them fits better into that movie. So for example, we see Darth Vader's Star Destroyer, the Devastator, which is one of the first images from A New Hope after the opening crawl. Also, the firing sequence on the Death Star is almost a shot-for-shot remake of the previous sequence, and even featured Tarkin's iconic line, "You may dance if you want to. You may leave your friends behind." No, it's
"You may fire when ready."
And the 3D depiction of the Death Star plans looks exactly the same as when Jan Dodonna debriefed the pilots before the Battle of Yavin. We also hear Captain Antilles telling a crew person to check the escape pods on the Tantive 4, setting up 3PO and R2 to use one of these to escape with the plans on Tatooine soon after. And then of course the final image of Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, which is obviously heartbreaking to see now that the actress has passed away, but thankfully it kind of works as a tribute, further immortalizing her iconic role and reminding us of one big reason that we all cherish the Star Wars movies so much. But it's not just the specific imagery from A New Hope that makes this sequence work, it's the whole feel of it. The frantic cutting, the intense action, the music, which actually featured a reprise of the Imperial March as Vader watches the Tantive 4 escape. And if you were listening super closely, Giacchino snuck in another more subtle version of the Imperial March music during the hallway sequence, which you can only really hear by speeding up all the choral voices. Listen. So the tone here is all perfectly tuned with the opening moments of the first Star Wars. And mostly it just feels right to see Vader be Vader. Like we've been able to relive Darth Vader's brutality in comics and books and games like Battlefront. But looking at the films, I would argue not since The Empire Strikes Back have we seen Darth Vader be the truly menacing, terrifying figure that he was initially designed to be. Like I don't at all fault Return of the Jedi or the prequels for humanizing the villain and exploring a tragic, sympathetic side to him. But there's a reason Darth Vader is considered the best villain in movie history. And it's not because we feel bad for him, it's because we're freaking afraid of him. Like he force chokes his own men and he murders rebels without a second thought. And he can stop you in your tracks with just the sound of his breathing. Like the most basic bodily function evokes terror. And you might have felt Rogue One is a little slow in the first half and maybe it's hard to connect to any character besides the droid. Maybe that's just me because I can't process empathy. But you can't argue that when it comes to the things we love most about Star Wars, namely Darth Vader, Rogue One really sticks the landing. Okay, that was a lot of stuff, even for a nerdy commentary. And I know I left some stuff out, but we actually covered a lot of this stuff in our trailer breakdowns. And really, these are just things that interest me as a Star Wars fan, and I'm sure we'll learn even more about this movie as time goes on. And again, make sure to check out the other Rogue One videos we've done, like how Tarkin and Leia CGI was created, how the ending of this movie ties in with the New Hope timeline, and then my alternate ending theory, as well as our argument for why the lines between good and evil in the Star Wars universe might not be so clear-cut. And then also, please like this video and subscribe to New Rockstars, because we make videos like this all the time covering all Star Wars content, but also things like Marvel and DC, Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, Westworld. And if you do subscribe, make sure to click that bell icon to turn on email notifications for when our new videos come out. And if you really love us, you can also contribute to us on Patreon, become a donor to help us get even more videos like this out. And of course, big thanks to all of our current patrons. And let me know any thoughts or theories that you have down in the comments. You can also hit me up on Twitter at EAVoss. I starve for attention, so there's a good chance I'll respond, especially if you're nice. You can also follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for updates for when our videos are coming out. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.